resume the recording here. Welcome everybody. Welcome back to the Forestry lunch breaks. Hope you all are grabbed your lunch, ready to learn something new. I realized yesterday I totally forgot to introduce myself. And I do this every time, and I don't know why. But I'm Patrick Schultz. I'm an extension forester with Washington State University in Southwest Washington. We are in the second session of 4 for this forestry lunch break series on root rots. Today, we're going to be talking about disease cycles of common root rot fungi, sorry. And we have our guest speaker back from yesterday, Rachel Brooks. Before I turn it over to her, just cover a couple logistical things as usual. Please make sure that when you are typing in the chat box, your to setting is to everyone. This is just so that everybody can see the questions that you ask, and so it gets recorded in the chat transcript later. I will be recording all of these, and all of those recordings are available on the event website, which is right here. That link is also in the email that I send you every morning. So yesterday's session is already up. You can go back and watch that. I'll hopefully get this one up by the afternoon and continue to do that the rest of the week. Other than that, I think we're ready to turn it over to Rachel.
Awesome. Thank you, Patrick. I'll go ahead and share my screen. Okay. Well, welcome back, everyone, to day 2. If this is your first day, no worries. Patrick just pointed you towards the lecture from yesterday, and you can catch up on your own time. Hi, my name is Rachel. I'm a forest pathologist with Department of Natural Resources based out of Olympia, Washington. Though I cover the entire state, and today we're on day 2 of our root rot series. Yesterday, we did a little introduction to root rots and their symptoms. Well, today we're moving on to their signs. So determining what root rot species you have on your property, and then talking a little bit about their disease cycle. The goal is to get everyone on the same page today. So tomorrow you can dive into the management options with root rots led by Dan Omdahl, another forest pathologist here at DNR. And day 4 will be honorable mentions, as we'll be focusing on like the 3 main root rots that we deal with in Western Washington today and tomorrow, but there are some other ones that I'll bring up on day 4. And we want to start today with a little bit of review, just to refresh your memory. This is going to look at 2 slides we looked at yesterday. This is a slide showing root rot stand symptoms, so sort of the big level things we look for when we're walking in the woods, thinking about what might be killing our trees. The first thing is that pockets of symptomatic trees are seen, meaning that they're all clustered. Second is you look for several stages of slowly declining trees. You usually can tell this because there's trees that have been long dead, trees that are recently dead, and trees that are just declining and not dead yet. Additionally, we look for trees in sort of a jacksaw pattern, meaning they're pointing in all different directions and not all in one direction, like what happens with like a wind event. And then we often see regeneration of other species or young susceptible species in these canopy gaps created by these dead trees. On a tree specific level, the main thing we look for is root and butt rot, so rot in the lower portion of the tree, and that's what I'm going to spend most of today talking about, how we look at that closer and what we're looking for. But you might notice other things when you're out there. You might see resinosis on the root collar. This is just the production of resin on the outside of the bark by the tree, indicating that there's something going on underneath, and this happens at the base of the tree in some species. You might also look up if the tree is still alive and see a thin and discolored crown. And remember that this discoloration and thinning happens sort of from the bottom up and inside out. You may notice a reduction in growth. The easiest way to do that is to look at the leading branch and see how much it's putting on. And if the tree is not growing very fast, it often has that sort of rounded top. And then you also may see some distressed cone crop. This is the tree's last ditch effort to reproduce. Often these cones just don't seem quite right. And then lastly, there's often bark beetle activity associated with these sort of weakened trees where the beetles can easily attack and feed on them. And we ended yesterday by looking at this one stand in Shelton, Washington, well, and some other stands. and showing why we think that there might be root rot on there. And the question for today is, what do we do next to confirm this? Now I'm going to talk about what we will do to determine if it's one of the 3 main root rot diseases we see in Western Washington. And I'm sorry, this is my least favorite slide, but I feel like I have to include this to make sure we're all on the same page. So we're going to be talking about laminated root rot, Armillaria root rot, and Heterobasidion root rot today. These are the disease names. They're talking about when the pathogen impacts the host of the tree. Now, you may know these diseases by slightly different names because there's no one common name that everyone has agreed upon. And these also change in popularity over time, despite them referring to the same disease. So for example, laminated root rot is often called Felinus root rot based off an older scientific name. Armillaria root rot is sometimes referred to as shoestring root rot. And Heterobasidion root rot is sometimes referred to as nosum root rot or anosis root rot. And some of these seem like a little history lesson, but the important part here is if you're looking at some older databases or just talking to someone who learned these diseases back when there were different common names, they might refer to them as a different name, even though it's the same thing. And this also applies to scientific names. So scientific names are often italicized and they're based on Latin words, so they're not necessarily easy to remember or spell. But these are agreed upon scientific names that the scientists have supported by literature and published. Now, especially with fungi, things that we're still learning a lot about, these do change over time as we learn more about their genetics and their host range, et cetera. So for example, laminated root rot is caused by 2 different species of fungi, Coniferoporia sulphurascens and Coniferoporia warei. The main difference between these is their host range, as seen here. Don't feel like you have to memorize the host ranges or anything. I'll point you towards resources at the end. However, these 2 species of fungi have had former different names assigned to them, and at one time were thought to be the same species. So sometimes they are referred to as Felinus sulphurascens or Felinus warei, or before that, when they were thought to be the same thing, Porii warei. And this is something we just live with in the world where we learn new things every day in science. This is also true for Armillaria. Depending on who you talk to today, they might refer to as Armillaria solidipes or Armillaria storiae, or if you're looking at some older databases, you might also see it referred to as Armillaria melee. And again, Heterbasidion has a similar history. We have Heterobasidion irregulare and Heterobasidion occidentale today. Again, these are separated by the host trees that they infect, but they too were also have different scientific names previously. At one time were thought to be the same species. So Heterobasidion anosum and Fomes anosas, which sort of gives you an indication of where those diseased common names originated from. Now, I know this is a lot of information. I'm going to be referring to them as laminated root rot, Armillaria root rot, and Heterobasidion root rot, but don't get discouraged in the literature if you come across different names. It doesn't mean the information is bad, it just means it hasn't been updated. Okay, so sorry about that, needed to get that out of the way. So if we want to figure out what root rot is actually in a specific site, which is very important for any management decisions we make, the first thing we want to do is look around and see what tree species are being impacted. So here's a screenshot of a table I provided in the resources I shared at the end of last class, and I'll share it again at the end of this one. This is not the full table, this is just a partial table to show you what it looks like. But on the rows, you have a list of tree species, and in the columns, you have a list of some of the root rots. And just here, since we're talking about this, this is a slightly older table, so you see anosis root disease instead of Heterbasidion root disease up there. So now you know that they're the same thing. What this table shows is a rating of how likely that root disease is going to occur on that tree species, with 1 being the most likely and 4 being very unlikely. And this allows us to get a sense of if we know what trees are being killed on our property, we get a sense of what root rot might be there. And this just helps narrow down our choices when we're trying to figure out what species is in the field. The next thing we want to do after looking at what trees are being killed is we want to examine the roots for rot and for fungi. And this is the most fun part. This is where you get dirty and have a lot of fun looking around and exploring and really getting to know your property. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to look for slight differences in the rot itself, and also to see if we can find any fungi growing on these rotted roots of these trees. So if you go out with a forest pathologist or a lot of foresters, the way they will do this is they will use a Palaski. They like this tool. I like this tool because on one side you have an ability to dig away soil away from the roots, and the other side you have a way to cut into the roots and look at the structure of the wood and see if there's any rot. Now, you don't need a Palaski to do this. Anything that can dig away soil or cut into wood will work, maybe a shovel and a hand axe, for example. But this is probably one of the easiest all-in-one tools to use in the field. Now, when you're doing this, there's a couple things that you should keep in mind when looking and examining rot. And so here's a list of rules of thumbs I put together that I try to follow when I'm in the field. The first is, if you're not messy, you're not doing it right. This is just good to keep in the back of your mind, to keep on going and keep on digging and keep on looking. Because ultimately, we're trying to see what's happening underground, and we only have a small tip of the iceberg, so to speak, of what's happening. And we're just trying to expose as much as possible to figure out what's happening. Next, you should look at trees at different stages of decline. I like to first focus on stumps and wind-thrown trees. This is because the roots are a little bit more accessible. So I can reach into stumps and see if there's rot in them and look at the surface. You can look at those exposed roots that are pulled up out of the ground when the tree fell. Those are definitely the easiest places to look, and also they've been dead for a while, so some of that rot in those roots are pretty advanced, and so you can inspect it carefully. Now, this is my reminder that any dead wood is going to rot, and it's not necessarily caused by a disease. So if the tree was windblown and it's been there for a long time and it had healthy roots at the time it fell over, they will rot eventually. What we're doing is putting the full picture together, seeing that there's something actually actively killing these trees over time, and then looking for specifics for this certain types of root rot. Once you look at stumps and windthrows, the easy ones, you then want to go towards those standing old dead trees where you can dig away soil and expose roots and hack into them. And then at the end, I'll move on to recently dead trees, and then if needed, symptomatic trees. These last two tend to be a little harder just because there's not as much root rot on these trees. They haven't been dead or they haven't even died yet. And so it can be harder to find that decay from the small portion we can see above ground. The next thing to think about is for each one of these trees you're looking at, the lower the better. You want to get down to the roots. This is a root rot, so the more roots you see, the better chance you have of seeing the rot. And the next thing, for every tree you're looking at, you want to examine a few spots around the base of each tree, because you might not get lucky enough on one side. You might need to go to the other side to find what you're looking at for. And then lastly, this often takes numerous trees to find something that you're confident about. So don't feel bad if you're on tree number 5 or 6 or a dozen, trying to get to learn your area and find something that is obvious to you what's happening. Okay, so as we're digging around, trying to inspect roots for rot and other things, what are we actually looking for? So I'm going to go through each one of these species one at a time to show you what you're looking for. Laminated root rot, what do we see? Well, we generally look for 4 different things when we're looking at laminated root rot, potential disease pockets. The first thing we look for is just general white rot. Laminated root rot does cause white rot, and it often does so in advanced decay by delaminating the layers of wood. So a misnamed root rot pathogen here should be called delaminated root rot because those growth rings of trees do separate as the rot progresses and advances in these trees. So you can see that picture there. The next thing we look for is Setal hyphae. This is just a fancy word. Don't feel like you need to remember it for a fungal structure that is produced by the laminated root rot pathogen. These look like tiny peach fuzz is how I like to think of it, or I've heard it referred to as like stubble on like someone who hasn't shaved in a day or so. It's really tiny hair growth that tends to be pink to red to brown in color that is produced by the fungus. And we'll look at a few different pictures of this in a bit to help you get it on. This is the hardest thing to identify, but it is the one that you can be most confident about that you have laminated root rot on your property. The next thing you keep an eye out for is ectotrophic mycelium. That's in that fancy word for just saying white fungal growth that's occurring on the root surface. So here's a picture of a tree stump on the top, and then the root that is exposed. Someone dug away the soil, and you can see at the base that root is a little whitish in color with that ectotrophic mycelium. And then lastly, you may find these sort of brown leather-colored fruiting bodies that are fairly uncommon, but you do run across them. So we'll look at a few pictures of that as well. So laminated root rot, the delamination is really what most people see. It can be thick and chunky as shown in the left picture, or really thin as in the middle picture, or a variety depending on the size of the growth rings of the tree. And you can see some pictures there. This is most obvious in advanced decay, so you'll see it often in stumps or on the roots of wind-thrown trees. Next, we look closely at that rot in a lot of different places on a variety of trees and try to find some Setal hyphae, because this is something the fungus produces, but not all the time and not everywhere. So I've tried to point it out on these pictures. The left two are just taken by cameras, and the right one is taken through a hand lens to try to show what it looks like in a little bit more detail. You can see the color sort of changes from sort of a pink to a brown to a dark brown, but in all cases it is sort of like a peach fuzz growing on the wood surface. Here's some pictures of it underneath a microscope. We don't typically bring any samples back to the lab. This is something we do in the field just by using hand lenses, but just to get a sense of what it actually looks like in great detail under an ADX magnification. You can see that there's lots of hairs on the surface, and that's what you're trying to find. That's just a structure that the fungus produces. Here's some additional pictures of the ectotrophic mycelium. On the left is some two seedlings I pulled up, and you can see that they are tinted sort of white. If you're ever uncertain, you can always pull up a healthy tree or expose a healthy root to compare. That's always good practice to see if the coloration is just something that is happening on these trees or something unique to a disease. In the middle picture is not in great focus, but I think it shows you a good job of how people expose the soil, and then you can examine roots. And in this case, this root is just a little white colored with the ectotrophic mycelium. And then the right picture is the one we looked at already. And then lastly, these fruiting bodies, they're crusts. They are kind of hard to see, and they look like a smear of mud in most cases, but you might come across them. And for example, on the left, that's sort of a sapling that was pulled up, and right at the base of the stump or the root wad on that tree, there is some fungal fruiting body in there. Also in the middle, that one came from a stump. You reach in and grab and pull it out, and the right one is a seedling that's pulled up that has a little tiny patch of fruiting body on it that's pointed to. Again, not something we commonly go out of our way to look for, but you might run into. And yes, that's laminated root rot. So when you're looking for laminated root rot, remember white rot that turns into delamination, Setal hyphae, ectotrophic mycelium, and these sort of crusty brown fruiting bodies that are uncommon. And that's what you'll spend your time in suspected laminated root rot looking for and trying to find to feel confident that that's what you have happening. And this differs from Armillaria root rot, which I'll talk about now. Armillaria root rot also produces sort of a generic white rot. It doesn't really delaminate as in laminated root rot. The most unique thing about Armillaria root rot are these thick white mycelial fans that are produced between the bark and the wood of a tree, so nothing you can see until you remove the bark. But those are usually what catch your eye the first and is the most important to find. They also produce these black rhizomorphs. These are structures that are kind of, I've heard them called shoestring before, that's the shoestring root rot, that also form between the bark and the wood of the tree. And then lastly, brown honey mushrooms are produced, but they aren't always produced, and they're only found at some points of the year, so they're not something we typically look for. And if they're not there, we definitely don't rule out Armillaria, but you can come across them. So white rot is pretty generic. Turns out I don't have a ton of pictures of Armillaria white rot to share, but the white mycelial fans are important. And so here's a handful of pictures in which the bark of a tree or the bark on the roots of the tree were removed, exposing these white mycelial fans. And there's two things you want to think about when you're looking at these fans. You want to make sure that they're pretty thick and substantial. So you want to be able to pull them off the wood with your fingers. And they should have some thickness to them, and that they should have some grooves in them, as you can see in the middle one, showing that they were growing as the tree was still alive, sort of the interaction between the fan and the tree. And you want to pay attention to these because there are other Armillaria root rot species out there that are not pathogenic, meaning they only sort of take advantage of already dead trees. So they'll come in there and they'll squeeze their way in, but they won't be very thick, and there'll be no indication that the tree was sort of responding to them. And this is just a reminder, this is between the bark and the wood of a tree. So you have to actively pull off the bark to see any of this. That is also true for the black rhizomorphs. These are also between the bark and the wood of the tree. These are shoestrings-like structures. Again, there are some non-pathogenic Armillaria species that also produce these, but you will see these in some cases. And then the mushrooms. They are brown, sort of honey-colored mushrooms that are fairly generic unless you know your mushrooms pretty well. I won't go into too much detail with them, but they will occur at the base of trees, or like this middle seedling here that was pulled up, you might see the beginning of a mushroom forming on that tree there. And so with that, you should be able to find some clues that you have Armillaria root rot in your suspected root rot pocket. If you see white rot, thick white mycelial fans, and then you may come across some black rhizomorphs or brown honey mushrooms. And lastly, what do you see with Heterobasidion root rot? We look for a couple of things with Heterbasidion root rot. This is one of the harder ones to be confident about, but you rule out a lot of things and you often end up with Heterobasidion. It is also causes white rot on trees. It tends to be more stringy than most, and at times you'll see these black flecks in the rot, and you will look at those a little closer in a few slides. Additionally, you may come across some delamination. Just like laminated root rot, this delamination occurs along the rings of the trees. Some people do look to see that, yes.
Sorry to stop you, but it seems like the PowerPoint is behind your audio. We're looking at
what slide do you see?
We're seeing the Armillaria. Oh, sorry. Oh, now it just switched again. Now we're seeing now we're in Heterobasidion. I think that's where we're supposed to be.
Okay. Yeah.
57, slide 57.
Yes, correct.
Okay. Sorry about that.
Sorry about that. That must be delay. I will try to move quickly and tell me if that happens again. And I'll
okay, I will. You must live in like the weird triangle of Zoom problems.
Yeah. Welcome to a DNR computer. Okay, well, I'm glad we got caught up to Heterobasidion root rot. This is a practice on your memory. Can you remember what I'm saying when the slides show up later? Okay, so now you hopefully can see Heterobasidion root rot slide. You have this stringy white rot on the left with black flecks. You can have delamination, just like laminated root rot. Some people do say that one side of these sheets is smooth compared to the other side, which is sort of pocked, compared to laminated root rot, which has pock markings on both sides. I find that really hard to see in the field, so nothing I completely focus on unless I get like the most perfect specimen. But you'll find that in the descriptions of how to ID Heterobasidion. And then lastly, you might come across these conks that tend to be rare and difficult to find, but if you find them and you're confident with your conk ID, it can help with identification. So hopefully the slides progress. I've switched to the next slide that shows Heterobasidion root rots with some stringy yellow rot pictures. You can see this is sort of a typical white rot, but it does tend to be a little fibrous. And then here's another slide where you can see some pictures of those black specks in the rot. The two pictures on the right were taken by just a phone camera, and you can see how you don't need any additional magnification to see these flecks, though it is nice, and that's why I included that picture of the microscope where you can see this sort of dark embedded points in this rot. It's more obvious in person that it's within the rot and not just dirt on the rot when you're looking at it. And then here's some pictures of some delamination in Heterobasidion. I don't have a ton of these pictures, but you do see how it still delaminates along those tree rings and can trip you up when you're thinking about laminated root rot. And then lastly, some pictures of the Heterobasidion root rot conk. These conks like to be in places that we don't typically look.
Rachel?
So at uh-oh, are we having a delay again, Patrick?
Yeah, I think what we need to do is turn off the video. Your video feed might be overloading your bandwidth.
I forgot that I had that on. Let me turn that off.
Maybe that'll help.
Okay.
But we're on 50. We can see 59 right now.
Oh man. Okay, so you're 2 behind me.
Yeah, it's strange. That's never happened before. Now we're at 60.
Okay, well, don't worry. I'll change to 61 anytime.
Okay, and there's 61. Okay.
60 was okay. I'm just moving faster than everyone else today. Okay, so thanks for that. We're caught up hopefully on slide 61, where you can see these conks. They tend to be in difficult to find locations. So the picture on the left shows the conks forming in the center of a rotten out stump that were only exposed when you hacked into that and removed a lot of the wood. The 2 middle pictures show the conks rate at sort of the duct level, at the soil level, often underneath needles that you have to move aside to expose. And then there's just the conk that I'm holding in my hand, so you get a sense of what the underside looks like. It's an older one, but they can be whiter on the base when they're younger. Now there's lots of other species of fungi that produce conks out there, so don't get concerned the second you see a single conk. A lot of those are just decomposers that only impact dead wood. Okay, here's my summary slide, slide 62, that hopefully is progressing. For Heterbasidion root rot, you see stringy white rot, sometimes with black flecks. You may have delamination and some other older rot, or you may not. And you may find these rare but diagnostic conks. So as you can imagine, it takes a lot to find indications of specific rots in your property, but it's definitely worthwhile, especially with tomorrow's discussion about management, because knowing what species of root rot you have is relevant. And part of the reason why the species ID is relevant is not only because they impact different trees, but they also have slightly different disease cycles or life cycles. And so here on the top is a picture of laminated root rot, sort of life cycle drawn out. And those curved arrows indicate the main route of spread that root rots have, most root rots have. And that's from one infected tree to a neighboring tree through root-to-root contact. Now, these pathogens are native and they have evolved with these trees. So this is a slow process where the tree is sort of fighting back and forth. And typically these root rots can only make it about a foot or 2 a year towards neighboring trees and then beyond them. So this is a sort of a slow expansion, especially if you have a larger property. It's very slow. This explains those pockets of symptoms and the different levels of decline we see in the trees when we're in the field. Now, the other thing that happens in laminated root rot and other root rots is that these pathogens tend to be able to survive in the dead wood of stumps and roots for a very long time. This includes years, but oftentimes we're actually talking about decades. And that's why you often hear root rot diseases referred to as diseases of the site, because once they're there to stay. They're not something that come and go every few years or something like that. They're really a part of the landscape. Now, laminated root rot does produce that sort of crusty fruiting body that produces spores. However, as far as we currently know, those spores don't play any significant role in this disease cycle, infecting or spreading the pathogen. So at this point, we don't do any management about the spores or consider them in the disease cycle. And moving on, we're going to look at Armillaria root rot, very similar. You notice again that the main means of spread here is indicated by those curved areas, showing that this is again a root pathogen that spreads slowly from one infected tree to the neighboring tree. Some slight differences with this compared to laminated root rot is that those mushrooms do produce airborne spores that have been known to infect healthy neighboring stands, though they don't do so at such a high rate that any management decisions are taken to prevent that infection, since it seems like a rare occurrence. The other different thing with Armillaria root rot is that those black rhizomorphs, those shoestring structures, can actually survive outside of tree and host root material and spread through just the soil itself, and that just sort of reaches the pathogens spread to neighboring trees that may not yet have root-to-root contact. And then lastly, Heterbasidion, again, just like the other three, its main means of spread is root-to-roots to neighboring trees at a slow rate, and it lives in these stumps for long periods of time, just like the other two diseases. The one thing to note is that those conks that are hard to find, they produce airborne spores that are known to infect freshly wounded trees, including cut stumps that can then infect their neighboring healthy trees. And this is up to a point where this is taken into management consideration in some situations. So the two take-home messages here is thinking about slow root-to-root spread and the fact that the pathogens survive a long time in these stumps. And just remember that there's also slight differences between these different species. Now, for some of you who like different visuals and are a visual person, here are some other diagrams of these sort of root pockets, root disease pockets, if they make more sense to you than my diagrams. You can look at those quickly. And then if you want to see some pictures of some real root-to-root contacts, here's some. They're older pictures because I don't think anyone recently has bothered to do so much digging to expose roots, but you can see whether it's with a stump or two neighboring trees of the same size, how these roots interact with each other and how much they spread underneath the soil. And knowing these disease cycles will help with management decisions you'll talk about tomorrow, but it will also help you remember the symptoms we talked about yesterday. It explains why trees at varying levels of death and decline are found in root disease areas because this fungus moves so slowly from one tree to the next. It also explains why you see this clustering as it moves across the landscape. And then it also can explain why there's young susceptible regeneration that hasn't succumbed to the disease yet. So in this picture here, you can see that young seedling in the middle. Its roots haven't grown to the neighboring stumps yet, where it will then be infected by the fungus that is in those stumps. So the fungus doesn't typically move towards trees that aren't connected unless it's Armillaria. It's more the roots of a tree move towards the fungus. And I just wanted to end with this picture. This is actually from Eastern Oregon, but I think it's the one that shows this the best, is that there are times when root rot pockets follow these diagrams very, very clearly. So you can see this is just a Google Earth picture here. This discrete root rot pocket on the right-hand side, it matches those diagrams perfectly. However, in other scenarios, there's just too many root rot pockets. The tree species vary enough, the age of the trees vary enough that on the landscape, it's more diffuse and less discrete. And it can cause a slight bit of headache when trying to figure out where you have root rot and where you don't. And this is something we see on the west side too at times. For example, here's an aerial picture, and you sort of pointed out all the dead and dying trees on it, and they're dispersed. And I didn't look at all these trees, so I'm sure not all of them died because of root rot, but there was root rot found throughout this area just based on the history of the landscape and what was there before these trees were planted. Okay, so with that, I'm just going to end by pointing you towards two resources that I'll try to throw into the chat right after this. The first is the one I mentioned yesterday. This is the best one for ID, the Field Guide to Common Diseases and Insect Pests of Oregon and Washington Conifers. They have a root rot section in there, and they also have that great chart I referenced earlier that shows what tree species are most susceptible to which root rot diseases. The second reading I have up here is written for Oregon, but applies to Western Washington very well, and does a great job of talking about, once you know that you have a root rot on your property, what to do next. So this will help you in tomorrow's lecture about management, or if you want to read ahead or anything. Great discussions on different management options in that book in the root rot section. And then this should set you up, hopefully, just a few minutes over for tomorrow's lecture on management options. What do you do now that you know what species is impacting your site? And you'll have the pleasure of hearing from Dan Amdahl for that. With that, my contact information is up here, and I will try, if I can find the chat, to put those links in there. And Patrick, let me know if I have any questions. And thanks for spending your Valentine's Day with me, y'all.
Perfect. It's a great way to spend Valentine's Day. Thanks, Rachel. That was great. So we do have some questions in the chat, and we will, as usual, stick around to answer any more that you want to type in at this point. For those folks that need to hop off, obviously feel free to, and all the questions will be recorded in the recording and uploaded to YouTube. So that link will be available shortly. So Dan, our guest speaker for tomorrow, was actually, he's not on now, but he was answering some questions in the chat, but I'm going to go ahead and read them out anyway so they get recorded. The first question we have is from Steve, and he asks, will root rot fungus in the ground prevent the growth of seedlings of the same tree species with the root rot, or does it primarily affect larger trees? So basically asking about planting trees back to the same site.
I'm happy to answer these, or if you want to read Dan's answers, I'll just answer them. So the benefit with young trees is they don't have a lot of roots yet, so they haven't been exposed necessarily to the neighboring infected old roots or symptomatic trees. So you often do plant in a root rot pocket and have no mortality for a few years before the trees get larger and the roots start expanding in the area they impact. So it's not like seedlings can't be killed by root rot, they just aren't as readily infected, but those seedlings will often come up and have delayed mortality as they're growing, which is unfortunate if you're not paying attention and you replant a site that's root rot with the same tree species. Everything looks good for a while until it doesn't.
Yeah, and that's pretty much what Dan said, and that answers Steve's second question, which is how long would it take a seedling to die? And if it was in direct contact with an existing root, then it would be very quick, but otherwise it has to take the time to grow the roots to get in contact with that fungus.
Exactly, yeah. Sometimes we see the youngest seedlings dying, like if they're planted right next to an infected stump, like within a foot or something, it's going to be the first probably to go.
So Carol asked, and I don't know exactly what slide this is referring to, but she noticed that you had the tilde in front of some of the words. Usually that means like approximate. Is that what you were using that for? She's getting some clarification.
Yeah, that was probably on my what species. That's sort of a really painful slide about the name changes for some of these diseases. I had it under the host, and that's because I was clumping some of those tree species together. So not all fir species are the same for these diseases, but I wasn't going to list them out, just provide you all with a resource to look that up. So I probably said generally firs, or that's sort of what that was indicating.
Sure. Yeah, and I know even the root rot names have changed. Root rots are like the one exception to my rule of using the scientific names. Instead, I just use the common names because I'm tired of the scientific name changing.
Yeah.
So Marion asked, can buying firewood from trees with root rot and bringing it onto the property infect that area where you put the firewood?
For these root rots, no. So there's a lot of things we can move with firewood, and that's why there's a huge campaign about don't move firewood and burn it where you buy it. Super important with some of these invasive pests and non-natives. root rots, it's not a way to infect a site. There's just not enough pathogen material in that firewood to get into the soil, into the roots. So you're fine doing that. Don't worry about that.
Yeah, but I do appreciate that comment because generally, not moving firewood is pretty good behavior, especially now we have emerald ash borer in the region down in Oregon, and that will certainly be transported on firewood. So buy it where you burn it. That's the phrase.
Yeah. But if you have a root rot pocket on your property, feel free to harvest that wood to burn on your site.
Yeah, exactly. Ryan asks, I've heard, and you did touch on this, but we'll just go ahead and answer it anyway. I've heard that laminated root rot can remain viable in the soil for 60 plus years. Is that true? And if so, is that true of all root rots?
Yeah, so I don't have the exact number for laminated on the top of my head, but 60 years would not surprise me, especially on some of the larger, older stumps. Basically, in my mind, it could be on the property until you can step through that stump without putting any effort into that step. So when you're in the woods and you step on a log and it's so rotten, there's like nothing below your foot until you hit the soil. I suspect laminated could still be in that stump until it reaches that level of decay, which can take quite a long time in our forest here, especially in our larger trees. And yes, most root rots can survive in dead host material for quite a long time.
Yeah, and there are some examples of industrial timber owners going through a full dug fir rotation or non-dug fir rotation, then planting back dug fir on a laminated root rot site, and then getting the root rot disease back. So it is a disease of the site, as you said. Elliot asked if you could give a little more background on yellow rot, and he asked, was that a Douglas fir or pine root in the photo? So maybe we could go back in the slides.
Yeah, let me see. Okay, so yellow rot. So it causes a white rot that happens to be more on the yellow side. I should clarify that. Okay.
I really like your graphics, by the way. I might steal those.
Thanks. Okay, so it is a white rot, but in general, to our human eyes, looks stringier than most and more yellow than most. Let's see. These are not my pictures because I didn't have as good pictures as these ones, so I do not know the answer to your question, but these are all evergreen tree species as far as I remember that I pulled in that we might come across. I was trying not to get any other weird ones out there.
So Carol asked, are conks always indicative of disease?
Great, important question. No, lots of fungi species produce conks. Conks are a fruiting body. They produce airborne spores that spread their pathogen around and help with sexual reproduction. Conks do not, I would say the majority of conks are not associated with any disease, meaning that they do not impact living trees. Most fungi feed on dead wood. So you will see conks in the forest all the time. Often it's just on dead stands that were killed from other reasons, and they're just helping decay it. Though there are conks out there associated with disease. Heterobasidion root rot is one. Some of our heart rots produce conks. So the more you spend looking at conks and learning the different types, the more you'll be able to figure out which one is causing what. But yeah, they're very cool structures.
Yeah. Elena asked, on a lot of dead trees or snags, we often see conks growing up the entire tree. Well, it sounds like you just answered this. Are these conks more often a sign of just the normal decay process? But if I guess it sounds like it's a living tree, which would probably be some sort of heart rot, right?
Yeah, if you have conks growing on a living tree, you might have a rot that is in the heartwood of a tree, so the center wood of the tree, depending on that. If these conks are on dead trees, and definitely if you see a conk, you want to look up and make sure the tree is alive or dead. One thing, we do see some You might mistake them for conks. I wouldn't call them true conks, but pouch fungi is introduced into Doug fir often by a bark beetle attack, and which bark beetle attack can happen often in root rot disease areas, and these will produce sort of like white sort of pouches all over the tree that you can see from quite a distance, going up and down the entire tree. So that might be an indication that there were bark beetles there. And remember, if there's bark beetles, you want to check for root rot. That's just one thing that popped into my mind if you're seeing it all over the place all at once.
Right.
But by that point, that tree is long dead. The root rot has made it susceptible for beetle attacks. The beetles have come and gone, and now you're just seeing the pouch fungi.
Okay, so Tony asks, are there some best practices for digging around roots that won't create additional problems for the trees?
For digging, well, I guess it depends what you're digging for. Construction around tree roots is known to stress trees out, and just sort of like root rots, it's sort of a delayed, like you can do construction around a tree, it can look great, and then like in the next few years, all of a sudden the tree sort of starts to look worse and worse. I mean, I've heard numbers thrown around, like you don't want to dig up more than, I think, like a third of the roots. It might have even been less than that. But just avoid compaction of soil and damaging roots as much as you can.
And I can't be sure because there's a lot of questions coming in, but I think Tony asked this around the time maybe that you were discussing like digging out roots for identification of root rot.
Oh yeah, that's good. I mean, when I'm looking at a tree, a living tree, I try not to do too much hacking into the tree, to be honest. That's why I always start with the dead trees and work my way up. There are times when you will want to know about a tree, but it's tricky with root rots because I've been on properties before and someone really wants to know if a specific tree is infected at the edge of a root rot pocket. And it's tricky because I want to dig in and look, but if I don't find it, it doesn't mean that any signs of rot, doesn't mean the tree's not infected anywhere else in this root system. So sometimes it's not really worth digging into trees, and other times it is because you really want to confirm it's worth taking down the tree if it's a hazard tree or something like that. But yeah, I mean, if you're digging in exposing roots, yeah, especially if you're the property owner and you love the tree, it's really hard to hack into it.
Yeah. Okay, so, well, Roberta asked about conks again, but we covered that pretty well. Alan asked if the chat will be copied and recorded, and it is, and I will upload that to the same website where the recordings will be. I didn't do that for yesterday, but that's a good reminder. I'll do that for yesterday's and today. Let's see, question. Are there individuals or populations of trees that can host the fungi without succumbing to the disease, or are these pathogens always fatal to the host individual? So are there carriers, I guess? Yeah,
that's a good question. So if you remember this here, I'll just, instead of flipping to the slide, I have like blur on, I'm sorry if you can't see that. Well, anyways, I'm holding up that book with that table I showed you, and you'll remember that it wasn't a clear yes, it can be infected and killed, and a no, it can't be. There was a gradient of 1, 2, 3, and 4. Some trees can get root disease, but will never be killed by it, some species. And I wouldn't call them carriers because the tree's alive and it's protecting the majority of the roots. So it's more like it's blocking it from spreading because the pathogen's not moving through the healthy roots. It's just sort of having a battle on the side of a tree and it never wins, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yes.
Feel free to add anything on here, Patrick, as well.
No, you covered it perfect. Yeah. Let's see, another question. If trees are dying from root rot, does it affect the trunk and branches if harvested? Basically, she's asking if the logs from infected trees could be usable for timber.
They can be. You might lose the bottom few feet if rot sort of moves up to it. The one thing is that as these trees are slowly dying, once they're dead, other beetles in particular will move into them. And once you have beetles burrowing into the wood, that tree quality of wood is going to really decrease rapidly. So you just need to time your harvest for a specific tree you're interested in at the right time before there's other beetles moving in.
Right. Yeah. And that's a difficult thing because root rot moves slow. So it's, you know, it's not like you can just go in behind the root rot and harvest a single tree each time, or at least a logger's not going to come out and do that. So you're kind of stuck with cutting it all out at once.
Yeah. But if you if you wanted to cut down a single tree for your own uses or a local sawmill or something like that, there's nothing to stop you.
Yeah, definitely. Let's see, another question here. On Thursday, will I think he means Phalaenus schweinitzii be included in the honorable mentions? I hope I didn't butcher that.
Schweinitzii will be included in the honorable mentions. It definitely deserves a place.
Yeah, I never get that one.
That's one we mainly see on old growth forests. So not one that timber companies are interested in, but private landowners maybe.
Right. Does excavating the stumps in and around a root pocket decrease the longevity of that of the disease on the site?
Yes, you'll hear Dan talk about this tomorrow as an option, the one that is really intense and not often used.
Okay, so this is an interesting question. I hope I'm understanding it. Are all of the species of root rot discussed today causing increased tree mortality on the west side now? Or has this level of mortality always been true for all the species of fungi discussed today? Yeah.
So I won't answer this in two parts, and hopefully one part of that answer is what they're asking.
Sure.
I don't think any of them are becoming more pathogenic for specific species. So none of them, as far as I'm aware, are evolving to be better tree killers. Are they causing more disease now than what they used to? I would say that's probably site specific, depending on how the site was managed. We've gotten really good at planting Douglas fir. So if you have a Douglas fir specific root rot, and you keep on harvesting and planting Douglas fir and harvesting and planting Douglas fir, regardless of where the root rot is, you can have increased amounts of a specific root rot for Douglas fir. But if you are having a more diverse species being planted, you might see less root rots. Yeah, site specific, unless you have seen otherwise, Patrick.
Well, no, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, there's the case to be made. I've heard that because, well, at least more for like in industrial managed lands, the fact that we've put so much Doug fir, which is a highly susceptible species to our most common root rot, that we could say that we've maybe increased the amount of root rot at the landscape scale. But I think you're absolutely right. It's for small forest owners, it's going to be totally site specific. Of course, climate change has made trees weaker too, so there's that 1-2 punch. But yeah, you
might be able to have a good guess based on your property history. For example, if you have a forest that used to be a field for a long time, you probably have less root rot than it did before it was a field.
Yeah,
if there's no trees there at all. So.
All right, a few more questions here. Are there beneficial deciduous tree or shrub species that can help suppress coniferous tree root rot?
Suppressed root rot, no, but if you plant a site with plants that are not a good food source for these fungi, you'll eventually starve them out. And so species conversion of a site is one of our main management tools, and Dan will spend a lot of time tomorrow talking about that. Hardwoods tend to be a good choice for a lot of our evergreen root rots that we have out here, though there are root rots that do occur in hardwoods as well. But yeah, it doesn't really suppress them. It just doesn't give them additional resources. You still have to wait for whatever is currently there that they're feeding on to rot and decay away.
Right. So Dave asked, how does mulching or mastication impact spread or longevity, if at all?
If you are just dealing with above ground biomass, you're not going to make a difference. If you're pulling up stumps and tipping that up, that will make a difference, but probably not much at all.
Is the laminated root rot ever sampled and cultured to determine species in the lab? Any practical use for identification of species in a pocket?
Practically in the field, no, we never culture for ID unless we're helping out with like a larger research study that's looking for cultures for, say, genetic work or something like that. Day to day, you just need to see that fetal hyphae in the field and know what species of tree is being killed to figure out what laminated root rot is on your property. There's no need to do anything more than that.
Yeah, and identifying the species is key to understanding what to plant back. It's key for management, and we'll discuss that tomorrow, I think, in more detail.
Yeah, these questions are great because it shows that if you have enough background information, you can figure out the right management decisions, even without having someone tell you. So I appreciate all of them.
Yeah, and it seems like people are piecing that together, which is great. Emma asks, can disease spores be spread to healthy trees via diagnostic tools such as resistographs or Palaskis or any other tools that you're digging around, for example, in the roots, and are you spreading it by going and using it on other trees?
I have never heard of that happening with a root rot pathogen. There are some pathogens that you do have to be careful with, but the only ones I can think of off the top of my head are vascular wilts and like maple trees could be spread that way. I wouldn't worry about it too much. I would worry more about moving dead wood around, like we talked about earlier, with what insects and fungi are within that. But yeah, I mean, if you're poking around living trees, we always like to not hack too much and to minimize our damage.
Okay. All right, so we got two more questions. This next one we kind of touched on with the early question about firewood. Can wood chips imported to a property for use as mulch transfer root rots easily? No, you're generally pretty safe with that, Marley. Had there been any kind of study to identifying if there are plants or trees that will clear a root rot from an area? So we got this question too. Yeah, so back to the planting back non-susceptible species as a way of starving out the root disease. That's really the only evidence we have. We don't have any evidence that planting aspens is going to go and kill the fungus itself. You're just starving it.
Yeah.
Okay, well, it is almost 1 o'clock, so quitting time. Thank you, Rachel. Appreciate it. I don't know if you're going to be joining us tomorrow too, just to listen in. Okay, cool. Great.
Sure.
Well,
I'll sign on.
Perfect. Well, we have Dan Amdahl tomorrow to talk about management. Rachel will be here as well. I, of course, will also be here. So I hope you have a great rest of your Valentine's Day. And thanks again, Rachel. And we'll see you tomorrow.
Cool. Thanks, everyone. Bye.